Alright, today we're going to talk about insulin. We're going to look at some research to determine how much of a role it plays in not only fat loss but fat gain. But first, I've hesitated to make this video for a long time. I don't know what it is about the topic of insulin, but there's no other topic in the health and fitness industry that creates such a heated debate, almost like a cult-like following, almost like religious type of opinions and behaviors. And I'm not against you having your own opinion. I'm open to listening to anything you have to say in the comments below, but please be civil. I don't tolerate hate and just rudeness in general, so if that's going to be you and you do it, you're just going to get blocked immediately. And also, I don't have a narrative. Some people will say this, and I just want to say, I only care about getting the best information to help you reach your goals the best that I can. Anyway, as far as insulin goes, here's the deal. Your body prefers not to have elevated blood glucose levels. So if you eat something that causes your blood glucose to go above the body's preferred range, your pancreas will secrete insulin to get those blood glucose levels back down into that preferred range. So anyway, when this happens, since blood glucose levels are high and insulin has to do its job in lowering your blood glucose, it has to push it somewhere. And insulin is a storage hormone, so it can certainly store in your fat cells. However, it can also store in your muscles as well as your liver. So this is where you have to understand there's a big difference between someone who's living a sedentary lifestyle, who is eating in a calorie surplus, versus someone who's doing regular exercise and eating in a calorie deficit or around maintenance, as exercise is quite frankly the best thing you can do to make sure your body is preferentially shuttling that glucose into your muscles instead of fat. And in this case, insulin is actually a good thing because insulin is anabolic and it's helping fuel your muscles and performance. The thing you may not understand is when you exercise, you deplete your muscle glycogen. Glycogen is basically the storage form of glucose. So you eat carbs, your body breaks them down into glucose. That glucose then gets shuttled into your muscles and your liver. And then if there's excess beyond that, that's when it's going to start going into fat cells. So when you exercise and deplete those glycogen stores, you're just replenishing that. Now, the real concern with insulin can be insulin resistance, and this is what leads to type 2 diabetes, and it happens because your insulin is not able to reduce higher blood glucose levels. And if you have a condition like this, that's a different story than what we're talking about, but also understand while this is not medical advice, and you should always follow any doctor's advice you have that you're working with, but in terms of improving things like insulin sensitivity, that typically comes from losing body fat, whether you do it in a way that reduces your insulin levels or not, because lowering your body fat is most likely going to improve glycogen control as well as other health markers. And of course, there's research I want to cover here. This will really help inform us and make sure we're not just going based on emotions and our feelings, but what does the data say? And before I get into it, a lot of times I'll hear things like, well, you can't go based on studies because they all say different things, and maybe it's funded by a certain company or whatever else. And the thing is, yeah, it's never a perfect thing, but if you're not going to pay attention to science at all, where exactly are you going to get your opinion from? Like, how are you forming this opinion? What information are you getting, and why is that relevant when you won't even look at science? So just have an open mind here and see what it says. The first one I want to point to was a large study done over a year where they had people go on either a high carb, low fat diet or a high fat, low carb diet. And what they found was between the two groups, there was basically no significant difference in fat loss as well as most health markers. If insulin really was the problem, then the higher carb group should have had much worse results, you would think, right? Well, sometimes this gets picked apart and I'll hear, well, it wasn't low carb enough. It wasn't as controlled as it should be. And low carb is relative. Like, you ask 10 different people what low carb means and they'll have 10 completely different answers. But there actually was a study that equated calories and protein. And I always say that because it's important, because if you don't have calorie control, and then protein also has such a high thermic effect of food and is so beneficial, if you don't control those variables, then it's hard to know if it was things like insulin or anything else. And in this study, they compared from as low as only 10% of your calories from carbs all the way up to 40% of their calories from carbs. And it showed when weight loss and calories were controlled, there was no difference in blood glucose. The other argument will be, well, it doesn't count just to be low carb, it needs to be in ketosis. If you're not doing a keto diet, then it's not relevant, which, quick side note on that, I find that almost nobody who says they're doing a keto diet is actually doing a keto diet. They're more basically doing Atkins because they're eating way too much protein for their body body to go into ketosis. Now, I understand some of this is semantics, but the reason it's called a keto diet is because your body stops using glucose for energy and starts using ketones. That process is called ketosis. If you're eating a higher protein diet, your body will not go into ketosis. But even that's pretty much irrelevant, because there was even a study that looked at low carb diets that put people into ketosis versus a low carb diet that didn't put people into ketosis, and they found there was no metabolic differences between the two groups. So the argument that you need to be in ketosis also kind of goes out the window if you look at that. Another argument against the insulin theory is protein. Like I just said, a lot of keto people do higher protein diets. Most people at this point, thankfully, would agree that high protein is very beneficial for fat loss, or at least keeping from gaining fat, and just body composition in general, likely because of its high thermic effect of food, how it builds and maintains lean body mass. It helps you feel fuller, so you're less likely to overeat. But protein has actually been shown to raise insulin about the same as carbs, so if that's the case, that kind of throws that out the window as well. Keep in mind too, you don't need insulin to put fat into fat tissues. Your body kind of gets used to whatever you eat and uses that preferentially for either storing as fat or fuel. So what I mean by that is, if you eat a high fat diet, yes, you will burn more fat, but you will also store more fat. Just like if you eat a higher carb diet, you'll burn more carbs, but you'll also store more as fat as well. As your body isn't this on and off switch with either fat loss or fat burning. Your body is always simultaneously burning fat and losing fat. What we're looking to accomplish is push the balance in one direction or the other. And of course, you make sure you're losing more fat by eating in a calorie deficit to make the net more burning fat than storing fat. Plus, unlike carbs, which basically need to be converted to be able to put into fat, fat can basically be driven right into adipose tissue and stored as fat directly. So you can definitely gain fat even if your insulin levels are low and you're just eating lots of fat, if you're eating too many calories. The other thing you may be looking at is something called the glycemic index. If you've never heard of that, it's basically a value to measure how certain foods increase blood glucose levels. So if high glycemic index foods raise insulin levels more, which they do, we would see that diets that are higher GI would have worse results than what lower GI diets have shown, but that's not what I've seen. Basically, every study I've ever seen where calories were controlled and they looked at high GI versus low GI showed not only no difference in fat loss, but also most health markers as well. Also, the other thing you may not understand about GI is that this is measured in a fasted state, eating that food alone and nothing else. When you eat those foods in a mixed meal, so especially if you're having more protein or higher fiber along with it, that GI response is almost entirely blunted by doing so. So unless you're eating that food with nothing else and completely fasted, it's kind of irrelevant anyways. And if you still don't believe me, check out this study on sugar, where again, they equated macros, but they had one group do a high amount of sugar and the other group a low amount. So I believe the low sugar group ate around 4% of their calories from sugar, and the higher sugar group ate around something like 44% of their calories from sugar. Huge difference in sugar, and guess what? No difference in fat loss, and almost all health markers were the same as well, just a tiny difference in LDL cholesterol, and you could probably say that's because of the higher sugar group having less fiber. I find it almost seems like it's not necessarily the higher sugar in diets that's the problem, but the lower fiber that comes along with it. But the point is, if insulin was the problem, there would have been a large difference between these two groups, but there wasn't. Now, am I suggesting that you should just go out and eat lots of sugar all the time? Absolutely not. Besides, sugar is easy to overeat. That's one of the biggest problems. It's not that it just stores as fat. It's not very filling. It's void of any good micronutrients and vitamins and minerals. Oftentimes when you eat it, you crave more, so it can be easier to overeat your calories. And I think all these studies show that it's not the insulin itself that's causing the problem. Now, with all that being said, it's fine if you like a low carb diet and you like to eat higher fat. I don't have any problems with that. Some people say it helps them feel fuller, they feel more satisfied, and that can be a great benefit. But even then, even if there was a small difference in the results with regards to how much insulin you had, if you can't stay on your diet because you hate it and you find it completely unsustainable, then what does it really matter? Because sustainability is the most important thing here. It doesn't matter what you do if you're just gonna quit. So forcing yourself to eat in this way you hate weight, probably not a great solution. And if anything, this should be good news for you, even if you thought it wasn't true, because now you have more options and you can be more flexible and still get results. Because in my opinion, one of the biggest reasons why people tend to always gain the weight back after they lose it is because they diet in unsustainable manners. Which if this has been you, then I want you to make sure you check out this top video next, and I'll cover what you need to know to make sure this time you lose the weight and actually keep it off forever. Otherwise, I'll see you in one of these other 2 videos.